Last Friday, the world changed. At 11 p.m. on January 31st, 2020, when after 46 and a bit years, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland formally left the institution known as the European Union. Symbolically, that's huge. And symbolically, as I say, the world has changed. But since then, after the party in Parliament Square and other places around the country had been cleared up, we won't really notice the difference. Unlike at the end of the lovely Ealing comedy from the 50s, Passport to Pimlico, where Pimlico comes back into the embrace of Britain after a period spent within the Kingdom of Burgundy. The weather hasn't suddenly got worse. Although having said that, in fact, today is a beautiful, sparkling winter's day. Maybe it's an omen. I think we'll notice the difference mostly is when we travel to, but not from, European Union countries. We'll have to stand in line along with all the Chinese, Australians, Canadians, Brazilians, Nigerians and Americans. Along with that, we'll probably have to deal with some officious border and customs personnel who'll likely make a point about delaying us unnecessarily. And that'll be about that. But once we're through, we'll be welcomed, or not, as we always have, or haven't. And the Europeans will treat us as they always have, as individuals. So not much is going to change initially, and not much that we'll notice. After all, we'll still have the withdrawal agreement to get through, which is hardly Brexit in substance. I did read it a while back, but I've been guilt-tripped into reading it again by a guy on Twitter who insists that what we're getting is not Brexit at all. So that we're not all viewing this through rose-tinted spectacles, I suggest that you all read it too. So what we are getting may not in fact be Brexit that we all voted for, but it is at least a start. To paraphrase Churchill after El Alamein, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but is perhaps the end of the beginning. So we'll have to see how it plays out, and we'll have to see whether Boris is going to use his considerable democratic leverage to carve out the best deal for us. But as anecdotally speaking, Boris's relationship with the truth is perhaps not ironclad. We'll have to keep an eye on him. I, for one, am cautiously optimistic, and I don't say that very often. So hopefully those at the top will keep their word to the British electorate. On that score, we'll have to have some faith. But for those of us at the bottom, we, the little people, also have our job to do, as this was a bottom-up revolution, and I think we can call it a revolution of sorts. We again have the ability to effect change. So how do we do that? How can we support Brexit and make sure that it is a success? Well, this is obvious. But it is so obvious that many of us won't see it, because it is hiding in plain sight. Much is made of Britain being a trading nation, and is often being trumpeted as a virtue. And it is, in many respects. But that impulse is often promoted by those who have a vested interest in keeping it so. People make money in importing stuff and selling it to us, and that's fine. But there has been far too much of that side of the coin, the import side. What's there been not nearly enough of is the same thing going the other way, by making money in selling stuff abroad. All the focus has been on making money out of our compatriots, rather than out of foreigners. This for me has been one of the major reasons why I wanted out of the EU. In the early 70s, this country had close to a balance in trade with what was then the common market. By 1975, after we'd been in for a couple of years, that balance was already beginning to slide, with Peter Shaw bemoaning that we had fallen into deficit to the tune of £1,000 million. That sounded a lot in 1975, before we effectively devalued the issue by talking in billions. Our trade deficit with the EU now stands at £66 billion, or 66,000 million pounds in 1975 language. Economically speaking, our membership of the EU has been a catastrophe for us. Not for nothing do EU manufacturers refer to the UK as Treasure Island. We've been a free lunch for them, and it's not just the Europeans. We are perhaps the most open economy in the world, even more so than the US, since we seem quite happy to have a Chinese company like Huawei, embroiled in industrial espionage as it is, to run our nuclear power stations and even get involved in our defence industry, which is something that even the most rapacious free marketeers in the US balk at. This has to change. The free market is all very well as a theory, but it must serve the nation. If all it is doing is facilitating the transfer of wealth from the UK to abroad, then it is not working. And the EU, with a free market enshrined in its law, but with a protectionist wall around it, has chiefly benefited one country at the expense of all others: Germany. Germany, in contrast to Britain, has a trade surplus with the EU running in the region of 150 billion. Or as Peter Shaw would have quoted it, 150,000 million pounds. Membership of the EU has been a bonanza, although it's perhaps true to say that it is a victim of its own circumstance, since Germany's prodigious wealth is now being lent on to bail out all the other countries of the EU that it has impoverished by its success. It's no wonder that Germany has been the biggest cheerleader for Britain to remain within the EU, and is also the greatest advocate for doing a deal that will not put its business interests at risk when we leave. I'm no economist, although I'm aware of an economic theory called comparative advantage, which I think suggests that this is all as it should be and that the market is working perfectly. But there are some things that one just knows to be true, and despite what an economic theory might say. And that thing is that we cannot keep on buying things from abroad without selling them some of our stuff and expect our prosperity to continue. We must be getting the money from somewhere to pay for all this stuff. So what do you do when you buy something that you can't afford? You borrow it. And again, that's all very well if you can afford to pay it back. But I'm not sure that we can afford to pay back 66 billion quid. And if we can't, who's going to? Our children. And are we happy about that? Or are we just trying not to think about it? However, as the little people, and despite Brexit, we will have little control over fiscal levers of policy, nor the levels of tariffs and trade barriers. But we do have the power to make intelligent personal purchasing decisions, and that means buying British whenever and wherever we can. Now, this has been tried at numerous points in our recent history and has usually run out of steam as soon as a new model of BMW comes on the market. Yeah, we love giving our money to the Germans, although it's not hard to see why. It's unarguable that they make wonderful things. And we like to have nice things, but should we allow our desire to have nice things outweigh our solidarity to our compatriots? I'm not going to answer that, but we should all at least be asking ourselves that. For there is a real world consequence to how we spend all our money. And it's more important now. It's more important than it's ever been, since it could make the difference between Brexit being a success or something other than a success. I was at a friend's house the other day and the bin lorry turned up. Was it a Foden, an ERF, a Dennis or any other British maker as it always used to be? No, it was a Mercedes-Benz. Of course it was. Of course it wasn't a British make. Maybe because there aren't any British lorry makes left. And why is that? Well, probably because of EU rules, written as enthusiastically by British EU lawmakers as anybody else, that insist that all government contracts have to be put out to tender and that there must be no national bias in the choice. Then the largest, wealthiest, most resource-rich, and yes, perhaps the best company will get the contract. So of course Mercedes-Benz got the contract. Of course they did. Meanwhile, the factory making Fodens, ERS and Dennis trucks will go to the wall because the British government were unable and unwilling to support them. So that's another 500 blokes on the dole, who then have to be supported by the British and not the EU government, which in reality means the British taxpayer. Now, as private citizens, we will have little sway on how our local council chooses who will supply them with bin lorries, but we can use that same logic to do what we can to stop impoverishing our own country and at the same time maybe keeping our neighbours and compatriots in work. This is one of the great opportunities of Brexit, to rebalance our economy back towards some self-sufficiency and maybe even improve our export capacity in manufactured goods at the same time. Despite what some people who've never bought a British thing in their whole lives will tell you, there is nothing wrong with our manufacturing sector, except that it is too small, amounting to only about 12% of our economy. Germany's is 25%, and Germany is the world's biggest exporter in terms of value in manufactured goods and is fabulously wealthy as a result. We are different from Germany, but we are not so different that we cannot turn this around. After the Second World War, having exhausted its considerable wealth in saving the world from tyranny, Britain had to go cap in hand for a loan to the Americans, who were, by contrast, sitting high in the hog. Since from that point on for another 50 years or so, as we were living on tick, there was enormous pressure to earn revenue to pay back the loan. The governmental policy of export or die was the result, and its most visible manifestation were the millions of MGs, Triumphs, Sunbeams and Jaguars that went stateside and that the Americans loved until the British motor industry fucked it all up in the 70s and we lost our lead to the Germans, a lead we never got back. And that's more than a shame. Sir William Lyons, the founder of Jaguar, was notoriously short-tempered when giving interviews, and after repeatedly being asked what he thought his greatest achievement was, didn't cite any of the world-beating models that he helped create, or any of the victories that Jaguar won at Le Mans, but instead, very well, if you really want to know what makes me proud, is that we never went under 50% in exports. That's something I'm proud of. But despite Jaguar's resurgence in the US since the very dark days after Sir William's time of the late 70s, they remain a minnow when compared to Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Audi and even Porsche. Because we have had campaigns and exhortations to buy British in the past, they never lasted very long nor had much of an impact. And one might be tempted to think that it is not worth trying. But that's a mistake, because even just a cursory glance at our trade balances with various countries will reveal some surprises. Of course, we had an enormous trade deficit with the usual suspects of Germany and China, with whom we are in the red to the tune of 22 and 23 billion quid respectively. We're also in deficit with Norway and Spain, 15 billion each, Belgium 10 billion, the Dutch 8 billion, Poland 6 billion, Italy 5, India 4, Portugal 3.5, Thailand surprisingly 2.5 billion, Greece, Taiwan, the Czech Republic and Hungary between 1 and 2 billion each. That's a lot of billions, but we're about on balance, interestingly, with both France and Japan, as well as Denmark, Russia, South Africa, Luxembourg, Finland, Brazil, Romania, Malaysia, Mexico, Israel, Egypt, Pakistan, New Zealand, Indonesia, Cyprus, Morocco, Iceland, Malta, Chile and Lithuania, Malta. Meanwhile, we're 42 billion in the black with the Americans. Ireland 12 billion, Switzerland 7 billion, Australia 5 billion, Singapore 4 billion, Saudi Arabia and South Korea 3 billion, Hong Kong, Canada and Sweden on 2 billion each. It is far from hopeless. And if you're anything like me, who has witnessed the steadily increasing amounts of foreign manufactured goods, and particularly cars as the most visible example, you may be forgiven for thinking that we no longer make anything, and that there is nothing that we can do to reverse this inexorable slide into debt with Germany and China. I would say, take heart. We are more than capable of making our way in the world, particularly if we allow trade with the EU to reduce and concentrate on where our trade is most profitable. I've been told more than once, usually by Remainers, that farming and the motor industry will bear the brunt of the costs of Brexit. Farming, I suppose, because of the gradual lessening of policies connected to the Common Agricultural Policy, and the motor industry because so much of it is foreign owned. The success stories of the Japanese manufacturers, Nissan, Toyota and Honda, having open plants in the UK are due directly to them having unrestricted access to the European free market, rather than just the British one. Good employers though they have been, their loyalty to Britain will only last as long as they remain profitable. And because they are foreign owned, it is difficult to unpick whether or not it is in a national interest to buy a British-built Japanese car. I would say in the absence of any British manufacturers to take up the slack, that is on balance worth it. The money may ultimately end up in Japan, but at least a British car worker will have a job. And it's interesting to note as well that Nissan have announced that in the event of a hard Brexit, that Nissan will concentrate on the British market and close down its plants in France and Spain, which is precisely the opposite of what the Remainers claimed. Farming is more straightforward, I would say, since once we are out of the EU, there will no longer be a requirement on the packaging to say product of the EU, as is often the case now. British produce can be labelled as such in a straightforward way, which will make it easier for us to make the right decision. The decision to support the farmers, who are our compatriots. We'll still have to buy olive oil and oranges from abroad, but as we will be looking further afield anyway, we may choose to buy them from outside the EU. See, Brexit was achieved because we refused to be silenced. It was achieved because we refused to shut up when they called us stupid and racist and low information. It was achieved because we refused to be cowed by those who insisted that they knew better and that such momentous decisions couldn't be made by the common populace. They thought that we would listen to them. They thought that we should listen to them because they were experts. They thought that we would just doff our caps to our social betters and comply because Squire knows best what's best for us. Well, we didn't. We knew that the country still belonged to us, and we claimed it for ourselves, and that really sticks in their craw. And that's too bad. They're going to have to get over it. But the point is that we, us, the ordinary, common rank and file of this country, made something happen against their wishes. We made it happen, and we can make other things happen. We can decide what we buy. Foreign-made goods and produce aren't just sucked in. It's not a natural and unchangeable thing, like the sea sucks the waters, the rivers into it. Imports come in because we suck them in, and we can choose not to. We can choose to be a bit more discerning about where we spend our money. We weren't scared off when they told us that we'd be poorer if we didn't vote Remain. We weren't scared off when they told us we'd lose our jobs. Our instinct told us that they were lying, and it's looking more and more like we were right. We had the power, the collective power, to insist on getting what we voted for. And we got it. We also have the power to keep this country prosperous if we choose to, and the power to make Brexit a success. They'll be waiting for us to fail. So trade is important, the prosperity that goes with it, and it's probably more important to us than it is to many other countries. And having profitable trade with those countries that want our stuff is the way to make Brexit a success long term. But trade, like money, is not everything. Prosperity is important, but other things like family, belonging, freedom, and the safety of those in our care are infinitely more important. So trade is a priority for all of us, but it's a long-term thing. There are other more pressing, not to say urgent issues that require our attention. We need to continue to invoke the Brexit spirit to address them. And just like Brexit, failure is out of the question.